November day 6, and for tonight's video I want to look at the concept of having a higher power or believing in God and recovery, and how developmental trauma might get in the way, even unconsciously, of us really not being able to establish that sense of a connection with a higher power. And this will be reflecting on the work of Pia Mellody out of her work Breaking Free and Facing Codependence, and Patrick Carnes' Gentle Path Through the 12 Steps. But I will start with Pia's work. Now, in a video the other day, I did mention this and there were some questions asked about it, so I wanted to do a video on this subject. So, step 2 says, in Pia's adaptation of it, we came to believe that a power greater than myself can restore us to sanity. So this idea that in admitting the first step, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, but people, places and things, ourselves, and our life becomes unmanageable. It opens up this idea that we're perfectly imperfect and really need a connection with a power greater than ourselves. So what gets in the way of doing that? This imperfection and spiritual connection issue. So let me read her preamble of step 2 and Breaking Free. Step 2 addresses your issues of imperfection and your spiritual connection to a higher power. As I said in the previous section, to relate to a higher power in a healthy way that leads to recovery, you must be able to view yourself as being what I call perfectly imperfect and still value or esteem yourself. Problems concerning spirituality and a relationship to a higher power come up immediately in step 2. The goal of this step is to correct any skewed thinking you may have about 1, whether there is a higher power, 2, how it will respond to you if you turn to it, and 3, whether you need to be restored to sanity. This is the process of coming to believe that a power greater than yourself and greater than your parents can restore you to sanity. To me, the sanity to which codependents or developmentally immature people must be restored is a knowledge that we are perfectly imperfect, that we can only do certain things about that, and that imperfection is the normal human condition. Now, she expands on this in her book, Facing Codependence, but she summarizes it here by saying, here is a summary of what I believe to be common problems that codependents or developmentally immature people have with relating to a higher power. And this is where she goes on to say there's 3 basic stances towards a higher power if we grow up in this dysfunction and trauma. Now, we can be 1, 2, or a blend of all 3. So we'll just go through those one at a time. There is no higher power. I am my own higher power. And that reads that 2 experiences a child can have in a dysfunctional family can set this up. The first is when parents abandon the child and never confront or correct the child's imperfection. The child gets the message that anything he or she wants to do or say is acceptable. There is no higher power to guide and correct such a child in these matters. On becoming an adult, the person doesn't really understand that he or she has any imperfection. Therefore, there is no place for a higher power in an adult person's life because the person is his or her own higher power. Further, such a person doesn't feel a need to be restored to sanity because the person doesn't know that he or she has any insanity. The second experience that can create this attitude towards the higher power is when parents enmesh with the child and manipulate him or her into taking care of them or their responsibilities instead of taking care of the child and leaving him or her free to be a child. The message from the parent is that the child is the higher power of the parent, of the family, or of him or herself. Therefore, in becoming an adult, this person has a great difficulty grasping at any operational level the idea that there is a higher power, having been the higher power of others and of himself or herself since childhood. So it can be confronting when you identify that as part of who you are, right? 2, a higher power exists, but it's not going to be there for me. So let me read through that. A higher power exists but is not there for me. This attitude is usually that of a child who was ignored in childhood. The parent was minimally involved with the child concerning a few dependency needs and wants, but not enough to teach the child how to acknowledge or take care of these needs and wants. This child, on becoming an adult and considering the concept of a higher power, believes that a higher power exists but won't restore him or her to sanity. The person cannot turn to a higher power for help or strength in any real sense because he or she expects to be ignored. The third one is that there is a higher power, but it's going to be harsh, punitive, and critical, and the process of being restored to sanity will be shaming, painful, and miserable. Pia goes on to say about that That this is usually the attitude of the child who was attacked with criticism and punishment when he or she was imperfect. In adulthood, this person might believe that there's a higher power greater than himself or herself that will restore the person to sanity, but doesn't believe that it's going to be comfortable or that life will be any better. The person has a negative relationship with a higher power and cannot embrace or share any issues of his or her own imperfection. To avoid being attacked, this person has great difficulty talking about his or her imperfection to anybody or admitting any of his or her imperfections to that higher power. This reaction can sometimes lead to actually denying that a higher power exists, so that the whole issue of being attacked and punitive can be avoided. If this happens, the person can also become his or her own higher power. The bit I might just pull in is on Patrick's stuff too. Now, Patrick says a very similar thing about this, especially about experiencing trauma and neglect, being shamed and criticized. That step 2, he says, look, ultimately it's a spiritual question. Steps 2 and 3 ask, who do I trust? And in whom or what do I have faith? How much you trust others often parallels your trust in a higher power. If you have trouble accepting help from others and insist on handling things alone, chances are you will resist the help of a higher power in your life. Many addicts who have worked the program realize if they refuse help after admitting that they are powerless and damaged, they will remain stuck in their insanity. The first step asks you to admit that you have an illness. Steps 2 and 3 ask you to confront the question of what gives your life meaning. Without meaning in your life, your addiction and co-addiction can grow and thrive. Without meaning, you cannot establish the priorities that help you restore the balance, focus, and responsibility that you seek. And I know that and I wasn't going to grab this book, but I will, in Patrick Carnes' Facing the Shadow, which is on his book on sex addiction, right at the beginning when he's sort of saying, look, where does self-delusion and reality distortion come from? He says it starts within the family, and he goes through and really highlights and says, do you have come from a rigid family, a disengaged family, a chaotic family, a family with addiction? But there's always one piece in this that I think in regards to growing up in developmental trauma and abuse that affects trust. So we can either, have difficulty talking and believing in God. And he says that one essential way to check reality is to share with others and find out their perceptions of a situation. This requires a capacity for intimacy. But most sex addicts, I'm going to say developmentally traumatized people there too, however, come from families in which members are disengaged for one reason or another. There is little intimacy. Now here's the thing. Children in such homes develop few skills for sharing, being vulnerable, or risking anything about themselves. As a result, they learn to trust no one. The further result is that self-delusion is hard to break and that secrets become more potent than reality. The worst effect is that the children are unable to ask for help. So whether that can be just with anyone around them, and let alone a higher power. So if I pull back into what P is saying here just to round this off, our relationship to our Father influences our ideas about the higher power. This fact is hardly ever conscious, and even religious professionals often don't realize that although their theology is impeccable, their actual trust level regarding their higher power is very low because of long forgotten abuse issues. A person's first experience of a higher power in this culture is his or her experience with dad, sometimes mum, but mainly dad. And that's what Pia says. And the way dad treats you becomes at some level how you think of a higher power is going to treat you. So if I just pull back into some of these slides just to highlight the point, she says there's 4 things here that we need to check to grow our awareness, to see if we can need to do some healing, to open the door to really being able to let the experience of a higher power of God in as we understand God. So the first one is if dad abandoned you, you become your own higher power, believing that you can accomplish your own recovery. You have difficulty believing in a higher power outside yourself. The next one is, if dad enmeshed with you and used you for his own needs, to take care of him or his responsibilities in the family, you also may become your own higher power and be unable to believe in a higher power that it exists outside of yourself. If dad neglected you, You may believe a higher power exists, but you may not think a higher power will help you or restore you to sanity. And the fourth one being, if Dad attacked you, you may believe a higher power exists, but might restore you to sanity, but the process will be painful and shaming because you think a higher power is harsh and punitive. So what she says about what to do with this. So if this sparks anything, please bring it up with your therapist or sponsor, or find one and talk it through, because it can be a real roadblock. Carl Jung said if we don't make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life, and we'll call it fate. So this is a chance to get really conscious about what might be getting in between you and having a relationship with God. So she says at the bottom here, review what you wrote in your history. So if you've done any abuse history work, and if you haven't, you might need to, about your father, then you describe here, how did your father treat you? Was it abandoning, enmeshing, ignoring, or attacking? And then you write about how this affected you, the way that you view a power greater than you. And it's through doing that work that you might be able to sort of just push some things aside to be able to help you get to being able to be humble enough and open enough to let in a God that loves you and that can guide you and that can be there for you, that isn't a mirror of that pathology that you came from. So I just wrote here, therefore we need to check how we experienced our father and mother and see how it affected how we see God. So that's this Movember video for today. There's the QR code if you want to donate some money. Anything small would be great. I do these videos really for clients and anyone who might get something out of them. And if you know someone that's doing a Movember campaign, donate something. It always brings a smile to your face when you see a little bit of money trickle in. And please keep a lookout for my on my website, stevestokescounselingandconsulting.com. I've got 2 workshops coming up with Dr. Robert Weiss and John Lee on some really exciting topics. With that, I will leave you and say good night.